Good evening, everybody. Warm welcome on behalf of the Forum of Ladies in Medicine. This is a unique platform to connect women faculty across the country and also interact with our male colleagues and promote the scientific understanding and exchange of ideas across different specialities. So we're not just restricted to one specialty. It's our endeavor to promote interspecialty interaction as one of its biggest, aims of FLAME. So with this, I would like to invite our esteemed faculty for the day. So we have none other than Dr. Sandeep Suri as our esteemed chairperson for this session. And then we have Dr. Prerna Goyal as our moderator, a young dynamic lady as we know her. And we have a very interesting panel led by Dr. Seema Kale, who is a specialist in internal medicine, Dr. Om Lakhani, who is a very young, brilliant, dynamic endocrinologist, known for his prolific writing in addition to great clinical skills. Then we have Dr. Harmeet Riayat from Jalandhar. She's a leading nephrologist there. And we have Dr. Chanchal Gera, who is also a leading internal medicine and rheumatology specialist. The theme for today would be hyperuricemia, a topic we hardly ever talk about, but something which is most common and I think most bothersome for our patients per se. We often see people walking in with reports of high uric acid, and they won't be focusing on their diabetes or their high dyslipidemia, but would come to you, I have knee pain, I have a heel pain, I have some vague joint pains, but there is my uric acid. So I think we need to understand this theme in particularly much more clearly and understand what to do with hyperuricemia in various scenarios. So to lead the discussion, we have our chairperson is Dr. Sandeep Suri. He is an MD Medicine and FIDM from CMC Vellore. He is a regional faculty for several platforms led by PHFI, including the CCE-BDM, as well as the CCTDM and CCRDM. So all of these are Public Health Foundation of India-led programs. He is a national faculty. He also is a part of the National Diabetes Educator Program, which is really an innovative program started about a few years ago to train diabetes educators in the country. Currently, Sir practices in Hisar and a really warm personality to interact with. So over to you, Dr. Sandeep.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Thank you. At the outset, I must thank Dr. Gagan Priya for the opportunity given to me. Actually, it was, you can say I was fortunate to attend the last FLAME symposium, say it was 2 weeks back. It was, I think it was on hypertension, if I'm not wrong. So it was really, I was really impressed by the level of academics and the topic discussed, and the discussion level was really inflammable. And the academics was so high that I just rang up ma'am that I want to be part of this FLAME symposia, and that's how I am here.
And so we are extremely fortunate and honored to have you with us.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And going straightway to the topic, that it's a very practical issue. And as madam has clearly highlighted, that people coming routinely in our OPDs, they are coming with the reports. And we don't know how to tackle these type of patients. And they don't have that typical symptom of gouty arthritis of first metatarsal joint. That is not there, and they have got vague symptoms and atypical symptoms, and we really in the soup that how to move with these type of patients. So we are going to discuss about that, and we have got a very esteemed panel with us, and I think I'm going to invite our moderator, Dr. Prerna, for inviting the panelists, and I think she's going to introduce the panelists also.
A very good evening to all of you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Suri. Many thanks to Dr. Gagan for organizing today's webinar. And I think thanks for giving me this unique opportunity to openly talk about a very common clinical problem, that is hyperuricemia. I think there are clear guidelines regarding the management of symptomatic hyperuricemia in the form of gout or uric nephropathy or nephrolithiasis in the form of uric acid stools. But very little is known about the treatment and management strategies of the asymptomatic hyperuricemia. Who are the eligible candidates and what is the cutoff level of the uric acid to start with the uric chlorine therapies, and is there like testing of the serum uric acid in a routine health panel is an appropriate approach or not? So these are the questions which we'll try to address in today's meeting. And for this, we have a very wonderful panel with us in today's evening. So a brief introduction about all the panelists. Now we have Dr. Harmeet. She's a DM nephrologist with special interest in social nephrology. Her aim is to take the concept of nephro to the grassroots levels at an affordable and sustainable nephro care to the mass levels. We have Dr. Seema. She is a senior consultant. She's MD Medicine. She is a practicing non-invasive cardiology at Apollo Clinic, New Delhi. Also working at RG Stone and Super Speciality Hospital and visiting consultant at BLK Super Speciality Hospital. We have Dr. Om Lakhani. He is a consultant endocrinologist at Zydus Hospital, Ahmedabad. We have Dr. Chanchal Kera. She's a senior consultant, Department of Medicine and Rheumatology at SPS Hospital, Ludhiana. Also an ex-professor and unit in charge at CMC Hospital, Ludhiana. So welcome you all, and we are fortunate to have you for today's evening, and thank you for sparing your valuable time for today's evening. So starting with the panel discussion, do we have Dr. Seema here?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, Dr. Seema. So my first question is to Dr. Seema. Although the definitions of the hyperuricemia, they differ depending upon the lab norms used and the test methods used, are there any universal standard cutoffs to define hyperuricemia? Like what level of serum uric acid to define what if this is hyperuricemic patient? And is there any relation with the age, gender, ethnicity? And do you find any role of genetics in the pathophysiology of hyperuricemia?
Okay, good evening all. When I was given this topic, I thought, okay, hyperuricemia, let me see. But my few hours, oh my God, I wasted or I spent on knowing what is the level of hyperuricemia. So from that, one thing is very clear that there is no clear cutoff of hyperuricemia. It varies from lab to lab. There is no universal or no standard cutoffs of hyperuricemia. By and large, for male, it is more than 7 milligram per DL. And for females, hyperuricemia is considered when uric acid is more than 6 milligram per DL. Now, why this difference in male and female? Because in females, the estrogen hormone has a uricosuric effect. That means it increases the excretion of the uric acid. That is why levels are little lower. Similarly, in children, there is more uricosuric, and in children also, the levels are lower. In fact, we consider 5.5 in children as the upper limit of normal. But these are not laboratory measurements. But actually, hyperuricemia is important from physiological or biological standpoint. Now, what do I mean by that? Uric acid is a weak acid and it is less soluble. So it just remains soluble in body fluids, either urine or plasma or interstitial fluid at a normal body temperature and at normal pH. So if the level increases, the uric acid forms or crystallizes very fast. And these crystals are the one which are important for pathogenesis in case of hyperuricemia. Now that level is 6.8 milligram per cent. So if the serum uric acid is more than 6.8, the crystal will form and that will cause damage. So our cutoff value actually from physiological standpoint view is 6.5. Now, as far as the ethnicity is concerned, in certain ethnic groups, such as Polynesians, like who are coming from Pacific Island or from Hawaii or Samoans or Tongans or Africans, they have higher uric acid because they excrete less uric acid. And in whites, the Caucasians from Europe, you have uric acid on a lower level. when genetic and family history is concerned, now, what was the question? Okay, in managing asymptomatic. See, asymptomatic hyperuricemia is the, I think, most controversial subject. Whether we have to manage or not to manage, there are ifs and buts about it. So the consensus so far is that we are not to give any medicinal treatment for it except lifestyle measures. So even for family history of gout, the patient should not be treated, should follow up, should be targeted at metabolic syndrome, etc. Certain genetic conditions like enzyme PRPP excess. Now this is an enzyme PRPP which causes uric acid to synthesize more. So if there is excess of this enzyme, then this is a genetic condition. Now in this, the patient will have hyperuricemia. Patient may not be symptomatic. So asymptomatic because they will present in 30, 35 years of age, but they need to be treated with allopurinol lifelong.
Okay. Yes, Dr. Seema, you rightly said that the solubility of the uric acid is cutoff is 6.8. Above 6.8, there is high chances of crystallization and leading to the symptomatology of the uric acid. And regarding the cutoff levels, the normal cutoff levels that has been said to be in men and post-menopausal, it's a same that it's in the range of 3.5 to 7. And for females, a little bit lower, that is pre-menopausal females, it is 2.6 to 5.7. But one important thing I want to highlight it is that the cutoff level, that the solubility of the uric acid at which it crystallizes, it also varies depending upon the pH and the temperature. Like many of lower serum levels, like at even 6 levels also. What is the like current trends, like what is the cutoff level at which the serum uric acid needs to be treated? So in that way, so thanks for a very well explained answer. My next question to Dr. Seema again is like before going into the details like various pathophysiological conditions caused by hyperuricemia, can you just briefly provide information about any useful functions served by the uric acid in human body, or we assume that just it's a waste product of urine metabolism? Like because in the human evolution development, as we compare to the other mammals, there was an enzyme that uric acid oxidase, and because of the development in the evolutionary phase, what happened is that there is a genetic or mutational loss of this enzyme. So whether the loss of this enzyme or genetic mutation or the evolutionary development, are we gaining anything? Because do you really think that uric acid is serving no function in the human body, or because of the loss of enzyme we assume that uric acid is serving some kind of benefits to the human body?
Okay, you will be surprised to know that it has got many functions in the body which are useful. Number one, if uric acid is not useful, see, I'll begin like that. When uric acid is filtered from the glomerulus, 90% is being reabsorbed. Only 10% is excreted. So if something was waste, why should the body reabsorb it 90%? That means it has some value to the body. Secondly, you talked about uricase enzyme. When we were like, moving around in the jungles million years ago, when we were hunter-gatherers, at some point time came when people were only on leaves and fruits and vegetables, whatever were available in the jungle. So at that time, the uricase was not needed because the diet was extremely low in sodium. So uric acid is converted into allantoin, which is a soluble form. And this is done by uricase. So when uricase the gene is still present in our body, but uricase is non-functional. So when uricase became non-functional, what was the purpose of that? Purpose was that uric acid will increase. Uric acid activates renin-angiotensin system. So what is increasing is salt reabsorption, because they were eating less salt. So this was kind of an adaptive mechanism at that time. So what is now coming to the question is, what are the uses of uric acid? Uric acid is a very powerful antioxidant. It is the blood's more than 60% antioxidant capacity comes from uric acid. And when it is antioxidant, so the first organ that is, if it shows an effect on is the brain. See, uric acid has a structure similar to caffeine. So it stimulates brain, it increases the intelligence, and it stimulates your cerebral cortex also. And brain is very sensitive to oxidative stress. So with uric acid, the oxidative stress to the brain is decreased. And if uric acid is low, there are more chances of degenerative diseases developing, such as dementias, Alzheimer's, multiple sclerosis. In fact, in patients of gout, it is mentioned that multiple sclerosis is actually not seen. And in patients of gout, there is 30% to 24% reduction in Parkinsonism disease, Alzheimer's disease. So it is very good neuroprotective, and it is a marker of depression. So if you have a patient and you're seeing in the clinic and uric acid is low and there is nothing else going on with the patient, not on any drugs, assess from depression point of view also. Then because of its antioxidant property, again, it is helpful as an anti-cancer drug, anti-cancer agent, because for cancer also oxidative stress is important. And secondly, it enhances T cell function. So that also help in fighting tumor cells. Then it is showing some type 2 immune reactions, which are helpful in fighting helminthic infection. So its role has been found in schistosomiasis. So it reduces the schistosomiasis infection. And there are certain other role, like it is a marker of malnutrition. So it maintains your lean body mass. Now, what is lean body mass? That is your body weight minus fat weight. So that means it maintains your muscle mass, muscle strength, and bone strength. So for that also uric acid is needed.
Okay.
I think
There are so many advantages of the uric acid, and like when I was going through the literature also, so these were the things like it helps in neuroprotection, it increases the longevity also required for the human intelligence, for the osteoporosis benefits also, and it decreases the cancer risk also. So minimum level of the uric acid is required in a human. So my next question.
In fact, the target levels recommended are 5 to 6 when you are treating for gout.
Yeah, in fact, there has been mentioned that like less than 3 is also harmful because there are high chances of neurological problems like dementia, Parkinson's disease, and multiple sclerosis also. Thanks a lot, Dr. Seema. My next question is to Dr. Om. Dr. Om, does the routine testing of serum uric acid, as it's included nowadays in our health packages also, like every health package we see serum uric acid is mandatory. Do you think that in a completely asymptomatic patient, testing of the serum uric acid may be as a prognostic tool or as a screening tool for underlying evaluation of the underlying cardiometabolic or renal assessment is appropriate or not?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. First and foremost, thank you to the Flame Association. I think it's a wonderful, initiative. And thank you to Dr. Gagan Priya. For me, she's like a mentor, I'm really indebted to her for having me for this. And I think the topic is also really fascinating. As soon as ma'am sent me a message saying hyperuricemia, I immediately said yes. This is something, there's so much to learn, and it's an interspecialty, interesting subject. You have uric acid touching almost every specialty. As we already discussed, it touched everything from neurology to rheumatology, endocrinology, cardiology, nephrology. All these specialties are connected with uric acid. So coming to the question now, there's one fundamental which I often practice and often understand, and this is something, if you're dealing with any chronic disease space, especially in an era where you have information overload, you have so much test reports available with you. What you need to really understand is that you need to differentiate whether a test is a marker or a signal, or is it a target, right? This is one very important differentiation you should understand. Now, the same test may be at different purposes of time, maybe a signal and maybe a target. But for example, let me give an example of another disease. For example, you take an anti-TPO antibody. Right? Now, an anti-TPO antibody is a marker. It's a signal. It's a signal of autoimmune thyroid disorder. but it's not a target. So when you're treating a patient with hypothyroidism, you're not trying to normalize NT-TPO, or you're not trying to kind of monitor NT-TPO. You're just knowing that it's there and you're knowing the diagnosis, but you're not using it as a target. What is the target in this case? TSH, right? So you're trying to normalize the TSH, or you're trying to bring it to an optimal level. The same way, for an endocrinologist, a uric acid is a signal. It's a marker, right? But it's not a target necessarily in all patients. So maybe for a rheumatologist, if the patient has gout, or for a nephrologist, if the patient has a chronic kidney disease, uric acid becomes a target. But for an endocrinologist, uric acid is a marker. It's a marker of an underlying insulin resistant state. Right now, it is very well known that uric acid is strongly associated with a insulin resistance situation. In fact, if you take, typically your patients, who come with all this, bunch of reports, you often find a pattern. You don't see uric acid elevated in isolation. You'll find uric acid elevated in a slightly obese individual. You'll have a central adiposity. The patient would have, if you go further, the patient would have pre-diabetes state, or maybe already having diabetes, maybe pre-hypertensive or hypertensive. The patient might be, if you see the liver profile, you might find an elevated SGPT, you might find a fatty liver. So all these things are connected, right? The body doesn't work in isolation. And when you see a high uric acid, it's typically a marker of an underlying insulin resistant state. So that's, for an endocrinologist, something which is very important. Now, should I screen a patient, asymptomatic patient, for uric acid just from a cardiometabolic risk point? My answer to that is no, because you have better markers, right? Now, if you did not have other tests available, perhaps uric acid might come to be useful. But you already have so many tests. You have a entire lipid profile. Even within lipid profile, you have other markers. Right now, emerging risk factors like urine microalbuminuria is a very important risk marker for cardiovascular disease, even in non-diabetic patients. Just simple measurements of blood pressure. You can do a CT calcium score. There are ample of tests available for us to categorize a patient in terms of cardiovascular risk. A uric acid, though useful, will not change my management, or will not change or re-stratify a patient in terms of cardiovascular risk. So if money is a constraint, which is usually the case in India, and if you have limited resources, and if you want to categorize a patient in terms of cardiovascular risk, I would not include uric acid as one of the markers, right? There are many better markers. And most importantly, we must understand that though uric acid has link with cardiovascular disease and uric acid has prognostic importance, unfortunately, we do not have any treatment targets for uric acid in terms of reduction of cardiovascular risk. So there is no good quality RCT which has shown that reducing the uric acid will lead to reduced cardiovascular risk. So in that sense, it just serves as a signal, it serves as a marker. And if you have got this big panel of investigation done where uric acid is a part of it, you might as well do it. But specifically to classify a patient in terms of cardiovascular risk, would I order a uric acid? Answer to that is no.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Om. Very beautifully explained, like what is the role of the target in whether we are targeting as a test, as a marker, or as a treatment purpose also. Regarding the uric acid, because there are many new papers that are coming up with it is the marker for, apart from the musculoskeletal involvement, it is going to the cardiovascular risk assessment also. And maybe I think there are guidelines, like a few guidelines by the European Society of Hypertension also, that has included uric acid in the algorithm as a marker. And there are a few cardiovascular risk assessment algorithms also. Maybe not now, maybe in the upcoming future, like if we have a simple non-invasive test, because right now we don't have so much robust data that is quoting that as a marker for the cardiovascular risk assessment. But the studies that are available that is showing the risk association, like more is a hyperuricemic patient, we have generally a constellation of metabolic symptom like dyslipidemia, obesity, hypertension, diabetes. So in that way, but right now in the present day scenario, like in the present time, risk assessment only on the basis of uric acid, it should go hand in hand with the other risk factors, and with the availability of new and good and very beneficial, more prognosticating factors are available for the risk assessment apart from the uric acid. Thank you so much, Dr. Om. Going to my next question to Dr. Harmeet. Dr. Harmeet, how will you define the relationship between hyperuricemia and chronic kidney disease? In the like whenever we talk about the chronic kidney disease, we take uric acid as a marker for the kidney dysfunction. Like we assume that if there is a chronic kidney disease because of the impaired renal excretion, uric acid will be on the higher side. But do you think that there is a changing trend, like uric acid itself leading to the new development and progression of the chronic kidney disease? Or if already CKD is already there, presence of the uric acid itself can lead to increased progression of the chronic kidney disease?
Ma'am, actually the relation between the chronic kidney disease and hyperuricemia, the way I see it as the same between hypertension and CKD. Just as hypertension leads to chronic kidney disease and chronic kidney disease leads to hypertension. So both are interrelated. So when do we say that it is the hyperuricemia which is contributing to CKD? Because in any patient, most of the patients, there are multiple factors involved. As we had previously discussed, metabolic syndrome. So I often see the root cause of all the majority of the patients that come to us is obesity, which leads to metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance. Obesity per se can affect kidney function. Obese people tend to have more of diabetes, more of hypertension. Again, they become as confounding factors. So the exact role of uric acid in causing the pathogenesis of chronic kidney disease cannot be defined per se. Only in patients, those who don't have other risk factors and they have very high uric acid levels documented, in those we can say that the uric acid is leading to chronic kidney disease. If we see the mechanism of action, very high levels of uric acid leading to arteriolar dysfunction, arteriosclerosis contributing to hypertension, then long term, yes, it may contribute, and hence it makes sense in CKD patients with higher levels of hyperuricemia to treat uric acid levels, though it has not been shown. Studies have linked hyperuricemia with CKD, but the treatment of hyperuricemia itself has not shown much improvement in retardation of progression to ESRD, just because in any single patient, there could be multiple factors. Only when levels are very high, as seen in cases of acute urate nephropathy, for example, in tumor lysis syndrome, there it has a direct toxic effect because of accumulation of crystals in the tubules. And in those cases also, to an extent, it is preventable because we know that these subgroup of patients are at risk. In fact, my oncology colleagues will be dealing more with these patients. These hardly come directly to nephrologists. So most of the patients that we tend to see in our OPD basis are, number one, the patients who get their tests done outside. In fact, it is very surprising to see even the peripheral doctors, they hardly get creatinine done. Even people with years of diabetes, they don't even get a single creatinine done. They get their first creatinine done after decades of diabetes, whereas they may be carrying multiple reports of uric acid. Since it is easily available, cheaper, every lab does it. And again, any patient with vague joint pains will get the uric acid, and most of the patients will already be on treatment when they come to us. So again, it becomes very difficult for me. But yes, I do take it as a target to treat, but only after understanding the patient's psychology. Excuse me, yeah. So unless the patient is motivated, only treating with medicines will not help a chronic kidney disease patient. You have to motivate them to maintain their body weight, to maintain their blood pressure, to maintain their diet, and most importantly, regular physical exercises, which is a very big challenge, and control their diet. So controlling uric acid is like just 30% of their treatment. Unless they combine it with dietary and physical exercise, it's not going to be of much help.
Okay, so what I can collect from you and from Dr. Om, that uric acid per se leading to cardiovascular and leading to the CKD, new progression and new development is like it's always in combination with the other risk factors. Like
Yes,
in combination with the hypertension leading to CKD because of the additional superadded effect of the uric acid leading to endothelial damage, vasoconstriction, reduced nitric oxide, leading to renal ischemia. So uric acid can act as an aggravating factor for the underlying causes for which are causing the kidney like impairment in the kidney functions. Thank you.
Only uric acid leading to CKD would be rare, not very common. The common things that we see is again related to metabolic syndrome only.
Okay, as for uric acid per se, we will not think about like uric acid leading to chronic chronic urine nephropathy. Thank you, Dr. Harmeet. My next question to Dr. Chanchal, because we have a rheumatologist, and when we are talking about uric acid, it will be unfair if we not talk about the joint involvement. So this is the most common presentation. Dr. Chanchal, what is your view, like what is the likelihood of getting an attack of gouty arthritis in a patient with hyperuricemia? Or any specific age group or any specific population who are more predisposed, who are more prone to get an attack of gouty arthritis, like out of all the hyperuricemic patients, who are the risk groups? And do you think that there are diagnostic gaps, like we are missing the atypical presentations in our clinical practice, or overdiagnosis in the clinical practice? Like many of the times the patients come with the ankle pains and they have like uric acid of like 8 and 9, and they correlate it with the uric acid. Does uric acid is really a culprit for causing this ankle pains? And moreover, many patients, they are coming with single joint involvement apart from the metatarsophalangeal joint. I know there are a few joints which are which are more exposed to uric arthropathy. But what is your take on that? Like, are we overdiagnosing it, or are we really missing it? Like this kind of joint involvement with the hyperuricemia.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Prerna and Dr. Gagan, to give me this opportunity. So, first part of your question is, what is the likelihood of getting an attack of gouty arthritis in hyperuricemia? Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So, if we collect all hyperuricemic people, there will be 10%, only 10% chance of will be there to have gouty attack in hyperuricemic population. Okay, so but there are definitely certain risk factors which will tell you that there is increased risk factor. So what are those risk factors? So definitely if CKD stage 3, if uric acid level is more than 9, that definitely precipitates or increases the risk of gout. If patient has urate nephrolithiasis, that also itself is a risk factor. So these things will tell us that patient has hyperuricemia, but along hyperuricemia, patient also has a risk factor for going or developing gouty arthritis. Other than these are clear-cut indications that patient is probably going to have gout. Other than that, maybe you can say minor risk factors are like if hyperuricemic patient, if patient is consuming alcohol, especially beer, definitely it increases the risk of development of gout. Other than alcohol, soft drinks, sweetened soft drinks. So if somebody takes more than 2 drinks a day, risk of gout increases. Meat is another dietary risk factor. So there are many dietary risk factors which precipitate patient for development of gout. Other than that, all of us know diabetes, hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, obesity, these are all itself risk factors for hyperuricemia. But when they are present with high uric acid, they are itself risk factor for development of gout. There are some protective dietary factors also which will protect against gout. Like if patient has good folate consumption, good vitamin C consumption. So here I will clear one thing, like fruits which are very high in fructose will precipitate or will give you one risk for gout, while on the other side, fruits which are low in fructose, they will protect you from gout. So you have to really balance that. So fruit juices and fruits high in fructose are again one risk factor. If patient is on diuretics, loop diuretics or thiazide diuretic, that will be definitely a risk factor for gout. And then certain drugs like cyclosporine that causes hyperuricemia and risk for gout. Low dose aspirin, that is also a risk factor for, so here is very interesting thing, low dose aspirin precipitates gout and high dose aspirin will protect you against gout, because in low dose aspirin is it has its uricosuric effect. So, sorry, it will reduce the secretion of urate. So there will be increased risk of gout if somebody is on low dose aspirin. So other part of your question was whether there is
Diagnostic gaps, like we are missing the atypical presentations or overdiagnosis.
yeah. So definitely gaps are there. I would say unnecessarily patients are labeled as having gout when they are not. So like we are really bugged up daily in OPD because any patient comes to you with any sort of joint pain has uric acid problem. So patient who have frank rheumatoid arthritis also, they will say यूरिया दी प्रॉब्लम दसी है जी ए दवाई ला रहे हैं. Even if you convince them, you have treated them for years for rheumatoid arthritis, clearly you have told them that you have RA, it is not uric acid. Even then on follow up they will get their uric acid checked themselves and they will say कि uric acid भी कराया है जी नाल. So that is little problem for us because all means for RMPs any joint pain is uric acid problem. So over diagnosis is definitely too much. Under diagnosis, yes, I would say at times because acute gout or even for that sake chronic gout also sometimes they mimic other rheumatological disorder. Especially I would mention here like when they come with foot pain, foot swelling, because gout is one disease which leads to lots of redness, excruciating pain, lots of swelling, which usually doesn't happen in other rheumatological disorders. So seeing that clinical picture, many a times diagnosis of cellulitis is made. Sometimes they mimic as sometimes it looks like even fracture of foot. So all these differential diagnoses are there. So maybe some, I have seen patients are getting treated for even cellulitis with antibiotic when they have acute gout with podagra. So under diagnosis is also there sometimes. Tophi also many people are not very much aware that what is tophi, how it looks like, and people tend to miss that also. So under diagnosis is also there, though over diagnosis is just too much.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Dr. Dr. Chanchal, for sharing very valuable information. I think in the various case series, 2 to 36% of the patients of hyperuricemia are known to have gout over a period of 5 to 10 years. And it has been found that gouty arthritis, arthropathy is accurately diagnosed in only 2/3 of the patient, and it is properly treated only half of the patient. So after this discussion, I want to Deep Suri sir. So sir, final comments from your side, like uric acid in relation to the cardio-renal metabolic continuum, like is it, what's your opinion? Is it a chicken or egg? Like uric acid is a culprit lesion leading to all these pathologies or just a marker?
Yeah, so I was enjoying the excellent discussions between all these experts and our panelists. Dr. Prerna, I'm going to sum up the things which Dr. Seema, Dr. Om, and Dr. Harpreet and Ma'am Chanchal has just told us in a few minutes. Actually, hyperuricemia or uric acid was just identified earlier days. It was just fixed to the gout. So our thinking during our undergraduation was only that we are thinking about hyperuricemia and it is the gout. But last, say, three decades, uric acid is now being identified as a marker for number of metabolic diseases and also hemodynamic abnormalities. Like you can start from metabolic syndrome, and once it is a metabolic syndrome, then everything is stemmed off from this metabolic syndrome. Obesity, OSA, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, CKD, heart failure also, and even prognostication for coronary artery revascularization therapy also. So if serum uric acid is high, then there are increased chances of stent thrombosis and failure. So now things are very much different. So the common root, or you can say the common soil of origin, is insulin resistance. And insulin resistance per se can lead to hyperuricemia by decreasing its secretion or decreasing its reabsorption, increasing its reabsorption from the renal endpoints. So, and also insulin resistance it leads to chronic inflammation and also decreasing nitric oxide, endothelial dysfunction, and increasing serum uric acid, which per se is an inflammatory part also. Because if you see that how hypoxanthine is converted into xanthine, and then xanthine again converted into xanthine again, xanthine oxidase number 1 and number 2, there is increased amount of reactive oxygen species which is coming out from this conversion. And if there is hyperuricemia, obviously there will be more reactive oxygen species, or there will be marked oxidative stress. And compounded with it, if there is insulin resistance and chronic inflammation already there, going to have all negative prognosis of all these things, metabolic syndrome and everything will be on the bad trajectory. And similarly, if you see there is a one pan-India study that was, very few studies are there, but there was one study in 2018, it was published in JAPI also. It was from Sri Lakshmi Narayan Hospital, Pondicherry, Medical College, Pondicherry, and also Government Medical College, Vellore. And they studied around 30,000 patients, and it was around hyperuricemia was 25.8%. But when they looked at type 2 diabetic patient, it was 33%. When they looked at hypertensive patient, it was 35%. And when they looked at both type 2 and hypertensive, it is around 37%. So there is incremental an amount of hyperuricemia as you increase these comorbidities with it. So, and number one. Number two thing is that there is two parts. One is under excretion and another one is overproduction that leads to hyperuricemia. So most commonly it is under excretion. And you know, there is excretory part. Kidneys are most important organ. 70% it is tackled by the kidneys and 30% from GIT tract. Once kidneys are not working, then GIT takes over. But still it is 70% from the kidney. And there is very intricate mechanism of reabsorption and secretion. First there is filtration, then there is reabsorption, then there is tubular secretion, then post secretion reabsorption also occurs. So there are four parts which happens at the proximal tubule and down the lane. So there is decrease. If there is decreased filtration, again hyperuricemia will be there. Increased reabsorption, again hyperuricemia will be there. Decreased tubular secretion, again uric acid will be retained. Post secretory reabsorption, again hyperuricemia will be there. So kidneys are extremely important. But most of the time, hyperuricemia is bothersome with us in kidney disease when it is eGFR is less than 20. So it's a terminal, or you can say stage 4 or stage 3 plus 4, around 4, when you are bothering about serum uric acid. There is one disease which we published a case series of 3 patients of medullary sponge kidney. When they have even with intact eGFR, they had very high serum uric acid. So there is a medullary cystic disease kidney disease patient. So they had this type of scenario. And overproduction is somewhat lesser. But still, because now we are dealing with neoplastic patients, oncology practice is very high, and also we are much more aware about tumor lysis syndrome, last crisis from leukemias, then dietary issues are rampant. So overproduction, you cannot negate overproduction. And I think now more of the burden has gone to our bad dietary habits, over usage of sugary drinks like fructose that Madam has already highlighted, then red meat consumption, and also the you can say alcohol intake. So all these things are increased. So that's why we are having an epidemic of hyperuricemia. And I think we have to take care of this. Even if it is asymptomatic, there are certain gray areas where you have to look at this also.
Thanks a lot, sir, for very comprehensive summarizing the pathophysiology of the hyperuricemia. So going from the pathophysiology to various clinical scenario, my next question is to Dr. Seema. I think Dr. Seema, are you here? Dr. Seema, I'm just I'm sharing with the various clinical scenario where to manage the uric acid. Exposed to office colleagues having an age of 45 and 48 years, they are getting their annual checkup, and one of them get alarmed after seeing the high uric acid level. The uric acid, one of the person is having high uric acid of 13 and the other is having 9, but both are asymptomatic, not having any comorbidities, normal BMI, having active lifestyle. So how will you manage these two case scenarios? One having high uric acid, both having high uric acid above 7, that is above the cutoff, Rather, the cutoff is 5 to 6 in the present scenario. But one is having very high alarming level, that is 13, and another is having 9. Will you really like to manage this patient with the uric lowering therapies or not?
Okay, so now this is a typical scenario of asymptomatic hyperuricemia.
Yeah.
Now there are 2 levels, 9 and 13. And as Dr. Lakhani in his previous talk said, that we cannot target uric acid. So I think I'll go by that. So there is lot of confusion here because there are many studies, animal studies and studies in children and adolescents. They show that if you treat uric acid in asymptomatic patients, their blood pressure goes down, cardiovascular events come down. But many studies are there which are contradicting this. So in these patients, what we should be doing, although their body mass index is normal, we should be looking for waist circumference. We should be looking for waist circumference, and we should try to establish whether they have central obesity. So in female, it should be less than 35 inch. In males, it should be less than 40 inch. Secondly, we should vigorously try, it should elicit dietary history. Are they taking any excess purines in their diet? So most important, they should cut down on beer. I mean, they should not take, in fact, they should totally avoid beer. They can go for wine, but they should avoid beer. And meat and organ meats, they increase urine level very high. So they should avoid. So basically, non-vegetarians are more prone. Even poultry food, fish, like anchovies, like sardines, they are also very rich source of. So we should try to elicit dietary history and should ask them to go for a very good lifestyle, reduce their abdominal girth if they have high, and see for any diabetes or insulin resistance or lipid profile. And this side, these metabolic factors should be addressed too. What we can do is we can get an ultrasound also to see if they have developed any renal stones. If they develop renal stones, then it is an indication to treat. If they don't have renal stones, then asymptomatic hyperuricemia should not be treated. And because there are 3 things. One, it has been seen that more than 70% may not develop gout at all. Number 2, renal dysfunction progress is not related to lowering of uric acid. Even if you treat, the renal dysfunction progress will not be reducing just by treating uric acid level. Number 3, stones are not closely related to hyperuricemia. As it is, uric acid stones are less, 10 to 15% of all the renal stones. So it is not clearly, the relationship is not established. So why give a drug which is not benefiting, which will produce side effects, and which will be costly to the patient? So we should avoid drugs. We should stay on lifestyle modification, cut down on diet. They should take more of cherries and berries. In fact, they are very good in reducing, the purines. So cherries and berries are good fruits.
Okay.
And
Dr. Seema, Dr. Harmeet, are you listening? Dr. Harmeet, what's your take on like very high uric acid, more than 30 chances of nephrotoxicity in an asymptomatic patient? Would you like to treat this patient or not?
Ma'am, since I've seen in many patients, the uric acid levels are affected by hydration status also. Like if I get to see one creatinine report, so I don't label the patient as having that GFR based on creatinine report. Similarly, if one on instance uric acid is high, it is always better to repeat the report and confirm. Secondly, if the patient had recently taken any high purine food in the past, maybe in last like say 1 week or 2-3 days, so then we have to come because a part of it is related to diet and a part of it is related to genetics. The diet part we can modify it, but the genetic part we cannot change. Even if I start the patient on treatment, the lifestyle modification has to be there. Number 1, which I agree with ma'am. But in my case, I would like the patient with uric acid of 13 if there are no other reasons known to treat it.
Okay.
Even I agreed with the reason that giving the treatment may not actually retard, but in CKD, we don't have many options, many drugs. So considering uric acid as one of the factors, because to actually establish uric acid as a cause of nephropathy, I should do the biopsy and then prove the lesions. In many cases, it may not be possible to demonstrate the lesions. So to give benefit of doubt, because once the CKD has progressed, then I cannot come back in time and treat. So
Okay,
dietary,
Dr. Amit,
lifestyle, and
I'm just
treatment.
little modifying the question for you. Like, suppose a person is having CKD with uric acid of 8. Would you like to add urate-lowering therapies? CKD maybe because of the IgA nephropathy, maybe because of the diabetic nephropathy, but uric acid is 8.
I add, practically I add. One of the reasons is because it is one of the factors which is associated. And second is again, if I don't treat, the patient may already be on it. And then at times I've tried stopping. For example, I've started a patient and after 3 months, 6 months down the line, patient uric acid levels are 4. Then we reduce the dose in patients in whom I had stopped treatment, say for 1 or 2 months and again repeated levels, because then the levels again increase. So it has to be shared decision making between the patient and the doctor, because allopathic medicines, they don't treat the underlying reason of the disease. We are just covering it from above. So as long as the levels don't go below normal, in my practice, to be very frank, I do treat in CKD patients uric acid level of 8.
Okay, so the present consensus in asymptomatic patient, irrespective of the level of the serum uric acid, we should not aim to treat with the urate-lowering therapies, and rather these patients should be encouraged to have good hydration and to focus on the dietary measures in the form of cutting down their beer and cutting down the high purine intake in the form of red meat, etc. Okay, and one more thing is the fructose containing the syrups, because the fructose is an agent which causes high uric acid because it depletes the ATP and leads to high uric acid formation itself. So in this similar case scenario, Dr. Om, I just want to ask from your side, like suppose a person is having comorbid metabolic conditions, like patient is diabetic, obese, on multiple OHAs, and with uncontrolled diabetic stated with a family history of premature cardiovascular disease. I mean to say that the person is already at high cardiovascular risk. So with the uric acid of like suppose 8 or 9, would you like to act on this kind of patient with high baseline cardiovascular risk, just to lower down his risk as an antioxidant and uric acid acting as an anti-inflammatory? So do you think that managing other comorbidities in the form of focusing on the blood pressure, focusing on the weight reduction, focusing on the glycemic status, does really treating the uric acid with the therapies will help this patient or not? Or we should go conservatively?
Thank you, Dr. Prerna, for that's a very interesting question. So, and this is something we see in practice. So it makes it even more relevant. So let's say I'm dealing with a middle-aged diabetic individual who is obese, who has a very strong family history of cardiovascular disease, who incidentally during the evaluation, the patient also gets a uric acid level done. Typically, like you said, let's say the level is something like 8. Now, here again, I'm looking at uric acid as an important marker rather than a target. So what it tells me is that I'm dealing with a patient who is insulin resistant, who is at a higher cardiovascular baseline risk compared to others. So my strategy in that scenario, because anyways, this patient is diabetic, patient is hypertensive, patient is, going to be given certain medicines. What I typically would do is that modify my therapy in such a way that will not only help the patient in terms of reduction of uric acid, also it will help in terms of reduction of cardiovascular risk. So to give you an example, let's take this patient per se. The patient is obese, patient is having high cardiovascular risk, having high uric acid. I would consider using an SGLT2 inhibitor as one of the therapies compared to the other medications which the patient would be taking. So what that will do is it will act on multiple fronts. One, it will reduce the patient's risk, cardiovascular risk, which we know that SGLT2 inhibitors is known to do that. Second, it will reduce the weight of the patient, which again, is an issue in this patient. Obviously, it's an anti-diabetic drug and pretty good in that sense. So, it will really going to help in terms of, blood sugar reduction. But most importantly, SGLT2 inhibitors have also been known to reduce uric acid levels. So, and it's a kind of win-win situation, right? The patient, that the patients who are fixated, like Dr. Chanchal said that patient want to be treated for uric acid. In that case, you are giving a treatment which is which is reasonably effective in terms of uric acid reduction, which is SGLT2 inhibitor. The same way, when I look at the antihypertensive medications, I would probably consider using something like a losartan, which is well known to reduce the uric acid level. Consider using certain CCBs, which have uric acid lowering therapies. Thiazide diuretics, on the other hand, or diuretics generally tend to increase uric acid. So, if the patient is on a thiazide diuretic, I'll probably stop that and switch over to a losartan or other ARBs. So I would modify the strategy so that, you have a win-win situation. Statins, fibrates have also been known to reduce uric acid levels. So all these things should be taken into consideration. And so what I would do is, instead of prescribing a uric acid lowering therapy per se, something like a, febuxostat or allopurinol, which have its own problem, I think we'll discuss that. But what I'm basically going to do is I'm going to use this signal to tell me that this patient requires certain medications in preference to others, like, for example, SGLT2 inhibitors, metformin, statins, fibrates, ARB, especially losartan. So these are the choices of drugs which I'll make in terms of treatment. And of course, most importantly, we already talked about lifestyle measures, which I think would be a good point to reinforce, to tell the patient that, these are the lifestyle changes you require, because these, food items have been known to increase uric acid level vis-a-vis other foods. So I think that would be a good opportunity again to discuss the lifestyle measures.
So thank you for wonderful inputs, Dr. Lakhani. So what I can collect is is that in spite of focusing more on urate lowering therapies in a patient with hyperuricemia, even though having high cardiovascular risk factors also, so rather than adding one extra tablet to that patient, we can change the regimen of that patient in the form of, like, we can change the oral hypoglycemic agent. Now we have SGLT2. They are such a wonderful drugs that they have so many additional advantage also. With this an additional component of uric action also, like it increases the uric acid excretion at the level of the kidneys also. So focusing on antihypertensive, like just you told about the losartan, fibrate therapy, and so these are the things that we can focus rather than adding one more pill burden to that patient, and that will be cost effective also for the patient. So my next question is Dr. Chanchal. Dr. Chanchal, suppose a person comes with the first attack of gouty arthritis and uric acid level is like 8.5 with the normal GFR, normal kidney functions, and normally the person, they are aware that this kind of joint involvement is most likely because of the high uric acid. They just come up with the uric acid report themselves, they get tested it, and there is a high tendency to start with the urate lowering therapy in a patient with the first episode of gouty arthritis. What's your take on that? Like, what is the ideal time for starting this kind of therapies, even at the first episode, or having a history of recurrent flares? Like, what's your take on that? Whether we should really start with the urate lowering therapies, and what should be the ideal time?
Okay. So recently ACR has released its guideline for gout management in 2020 itself. So it is very fresh one. So they have given very strong recommendation for urate lowering therapy only in 3 scenarios. I am talking about first episode of gout, not of repeated episode. So if person comes with first episode of gout, if person has CKD stage 3, patient has uric acid more than 9, or if patient has urate urolithiasis. So in these 3 scenarios, you have to go for urate lowering therapy. Other indications for starting urate lowering therapy will be like if somebody has like your patient has come with history of episode of gout. This is first episode, so I would like to have radiological examination, like I would look for erosions if they are present. So if erosion is present, it will give you idea that long-term disease is going on. Most likely it was asymptomatic or unnoticed or unreported basically. So if I get radiological evidence, if CKD is there, if urate is very high, uric acid is very high, more than 9, or urolithiasis. These are the 4 clear-cut indications where I would start that patient on urate lowering therapy. So this patient basically immediately that patient needs anti-inflammatory. So anti-inflammatory will be in the form of I would say first choice should be colchicine. If contraindicated, then NSAIDs. If like renal dysfunction is not there, obviously. And if these two are contraindicated, maybe a very short course of steroid for 3 to 5 days, 30 milligram of prednisolone. So first target would be to cut down this inflammatory episode, make your patient comfortable. But if at all there is indication of urate lowering therapy, that has to be started on the same episode during the episode. Actually, older school of thoughts were that we should wait to settle down patient. We should not lower down uric acid stat because that also precipitate crystallization. But now ACR has clearly stated that there is no need to wait. If at all it has to be started, it should be started during the first episode itself. Only problem is like if patient needs uric acid lowering therapy, it has to be for lifelong. So this patient has to clearly understand that it has to go for lifelong. There should not be off and off and off and on should not be there. So that patient definitely has to understand. So patient has to take in confidence that because this is not going to be, in case if some very strong reversible factor we find, like suppose if patient is very obese, maybe weight comes down with that, naturally uric acid comes down, that is different scenario. Otherwise, most of the time they need lifelong therapy.
Okay.
There were some other parts of also of this question. If I have missed.
No, Dr. Chanchal, just I want to ask one more thing. Like, you frequently see your patients with the gouty arthritis. Like, how many times have you encountered that there is high suspicion, clinical suspicion of that this is a urate arthropathy only and nothing else, but you check the uric acid level and uric acid level is like 6. So what is your take on that? Like, do you really consider urate nephropathy, urate arthropathy, or will you consider some other diagnosis?
So we are basically here talking about like when patient present to us with acute inflammatory episode. So basically I will suspect gout and I won't be surprised at all if I get it 6, because during the episode of acute inflammation, uric acid will automatically go down. That is the body's response. Basically, when inflammatory process starts, there is release of IL-6 and ACTH. So these two are uricosuric natural, you can say, backup plan of body, and because of that your uric acid level goes down. Usually it goes down during acute gouty episode. So I won't be surprised if I get 6, but definitely with the help of history examination I will carefully rule out any other disease if I am not missing. Definitely.
Okay, so we should go.
I would like to aspirate joint. If I get crystals, then definitely my diagnosis is 100%.
Okay, so clinical background is sufficient enough to diagnose with the uric arthropathy. Dr. Seema, just about the various urate lowering therapies that are available. Like there are 3 groups of the drug. We have xanthine oxidase inhibitors, uricosurics, and uricases also. So about the xanthine or oxidase inhibitors, the 2 important ones that are in clinical practice is the allopurinol and febuxostat. So what is your, like, if you can provide some insights into like what should be the first line and what should be the second line and how to choose about that agent. And there is a recent like papers about the cardiovascular events associated with febuxostat. Like in CARE study, they have mentioned about it. So what's your from your side, how will you advise, how will you take this question? Like what should be the urate lowering therapy as a first line and second line out of allopurinol and febuxostat?
Okay. So you want me to stick to xanthine oxidase inhibitors?
Yeah.
All right.
Data we are using right and left.
Yeah. Okay. So xanthine oxidase, when it is inhibited, the uric acid synthesis is inhibited. So allopurinol is a purine analog and febuxostat is a non-purine analog. Febuxostat is more powerful because it is very selective xanthine oxidase inhibitor. And febuxostat has come later. Allopurinol we have been using for decades. So the advantage of allopurinol are that we are comfortable with the drug. We have been using it. It is safe. It is effective. It can be given in kidney disease, but you have to reduce the dose at certain GFR. Then in liver dysfunction, it can be safely given. When I compare with febuxostat, but its efficacy, allopurinol's efficacy is little lower as compared to febuxostat, and we have to give higher doses of allopurinol like 300 and 400 mg to achieve the target level of uric acid that is below 6. When we talk about febuxostat, it is a new drug and it was established after confirmed trial where it was seen that it was more effective as compared to allopurinol in reducing the uric acid level. And in that particular trial, there were no increased cardiovascular events. So in 2009, USA approved the use of febuxostat. I think in India, all of us have been using febuxostat. Even I have seen on the prescription of cardiologist. So it has been used in cardiac diseases also and everywhere. So it is being used. Now, what are the advantages? That it is effective, more effective, and it can be given in any kidney dysfunction. And its dose need not be modified. So it's 40 milligram per day. You can give 80 milligram per day. You may reduce, like you would like to give 40 milligram in stage 4 or 5 CKD. Then if liver function tests are more than 3 times, then you would not like to give febuxostat. And even both febuxostat and allopurinol have severe reactions with interaction with theophylline, which we are commonly using in our COPD patients. So be very, very cautious and careful and rather avoid using them. Then there is an issue of allergy with allopurinol, and which is very, very prominent. It causes AHS, that is allopurinol hypersensitivity syndrome. It is particularly found in certain gene alleles very strongly. Now, this will give rise to actually anaphylactic shock, Stevens-Johnson, and hepatitis and vasculitis. It's a severe disease. It can kill the patient. So in allergic situations, we have to give febuxostat because that is safe. It has been found safe in those patients who are allergic to allopurinol. And the gene allele is HLA-B5801. This is the gene allele. It is found in China, Korea, and Pacific Islanders and Thailand people. So in them, it should be actually tested before we give allopurinol. That is important. And so what was the second part?
Cardiovascular events associated with febuxostat.
As far as the cardiovascular are concerned, we know that febuxostat, as I said, it was first in confirmed trial. There was no cardiovascular event. That is why it came into action. Then there was a CARE trial. Now this was a large trial of 6,000 patients. And in them, they found that the major MACE events were almost similar in allopurinol and febuxostat group. But mortality due to cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality was higher in febuxostat as compared to allopurinol. It was like to the range of almost 34% cardiovascular mortality and 24% all-cause mortality. Now this was, and sudden cardiac death was significant. So after that, 2017, USA issued a black box warning regarding the febuxostat use in cardiovascular patients. But it's like CARE trial, who cares? So that's how we do in India. We have prescription all across board and we are giving febuxostat. And so if I come to real world data, it has been studied in more than 4 lakh patients and they have not found any significant difference between in the cardiovascular events of febuxostat and allopurinol. So I think that is important. Then there is another trial, FAST trial, and there is a FREED trial also. FREED trial is in more than 65 years of patient, and it is being used in asymptomatic hyperuricemia. And they have studied cardiovascular event, renal event, cerebrovascular event, and all of these events are in fact less in febuxostat group, and uric acid lowering is also less in febuxostat group. Similarly, in FAST also, they did not find any difference between the cardiovascular event. So we have a long way to go. We need more trials. But the recent guidelines from American Rheumatology Association, they have included allopurinol as the first choice, especially in cardiac patients. And if you have to give febuxostat if patients are allergic to allopurinol or there is kidney disease.
Okay.
then you prefer febuxostat.
Okay. Just one or two lines about the uricosuric. Where do you place uricosuric in the management of hyperuricemia?
Yeah, uricosuric drugs means they will increase the urinary uric acid excretion. So they are useful in cases where the 24-hour urinary uric acid excretion is less. That's when we do 24 hours, and in a normal mixed diet, it should be, if it is less than 800 milligram, then we prefer uricosuric. And when they are needed, if you are giving for like gout, etc., they can be like, there are 2-3 drugs: probenecid, benzbromarone, and lezidonate. The probenecid is an old drug. We have been using it, and it is a broad spectrum. See, uricosuric drugs act by inhibiting the urate transporter in the proximal tubule of the kidney. Now, there are two kinds of transporter. Some transporter cause reabsorption of the uric acid. Some transporter cause secretion of the uric acid. And that's why they will eliminate the uric acid. Probenecid is a broad spectrum. It will act on the reabsorption receptors also. It will act on the secretion receptors also. And its affinity for the secretion receptor is more. That means if you give suboptimal dose of probenecid, it may actually inhibit the secretion of uric acid, and it may actually increase the level of uric acid. So for probenecid, you must give therapeutic dose, and you should begin by 250 to 500 milligram twice a day. And when do you give it? You give it when patient is not respond, the target levels of hyperuric acid are not achieved with your xanthine oxidase inhibitor, then you add probenecid in that case. And mind you, probenecid should not be given in renal stones, because if you have renal stones, they will precipitate further stone because they are uricosuric drug. In fact, all uricosurics are not given.
Yeah.
Then probenecid is a problem of blood dyscrasias. So it is contraindicated in history of blood dyscrasia. And when it comes, and the and again probenecid and the new drug lezidonate. Now lesinurad is for SURI. I said SURI is SURI, selective urate reabsorption inhibitor. So this strongly acts on the absorption receptors, that is URAT1 and OAT4 receptors. And it inhibits the reabsorption, thereby it is causing uricosuric effect. Now, the problem with both probenecid and lesinurad is they cannot be given in renal dysfunction. Probenecid, you can give up to 30 GFR, but not below that. And lesinurad, you can give up to 45 GFR, not below that. And one most important point with lesinurad is it can never be given as monotherapy. So it has to be combined. Because if you give monotherapy, combined with xanthine oxidase inhibitors. So if you give monotherapy, then it will increase kidney function more. And you have to monitor creatinine level when you are giving lesinurad. So these are the two differences. So uricosuric given when there is resistant hyperuricemia to xanthine oxidase inhibitor, so to increase the effect.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dr. Seema, for very beautifully explained and providing us very important points about the urate lowering therapies. I think the discussion on hyperuricemia can go on, and we have a lot of audience questions also. Like there's so much to discuss about the hyperuricemia. Like when I was going through the literature, there were some papers about the hyperuricemia and the infections, like in malaria. It is a marker of the inflammation leading to increased mortality in critically ill patient, as a marker of AKI also, acute kidney injury also. And so the controversy is still there whether to include uric acid in the risk assessment of cardiovascular risk assessment tool or algorithm or not. So I'm giving myself a stop here, and I'm over to Dr. Suri sir to kindly summarize the role of uric acid in today's changing time and what would be the future trends.
Okay, so we heard about the asymptomatic hyperuricemia, which is very common entity in the community. And I think we should, it doesn't itself constitute itself as a disease entity, but it is just like 5% of the population, but 25% of the hospitalized patients, they have asymptomatic hyperuricemia. Now, when to treat asymptomatic hyperuricemia? Number one, when your patient is having chemotherapy or radiotherapy. Number two, nephrolithiasis. Number 3, gouty tophies are there. Patient having CKD, binge alcoholics, or very strong family history of gout, urolithiasis, strong family history, and urinary urate nephrolithiasis is there, or urate nephropathy is there, and sometimes very high uric acid level, very high, 30 milligram for males and maybe around 10, more than 10 milligram for females. Then we are in the gray zone, then we have to treat these. So we should not ignore it. And how to approach? First, we have to look at the cause. Secondly, we have to treat hypertension, treat obesity, treat alcoholism, treat dyslipidemia. Dietary advice very important, and the acronym is PUFA. You have to restrict PUFA. That means purine-rich diet, fructose, and alcohol. So you have to restrict all these, and you have to stop them. Then, if your patient is having metabolic syndrome or patient having hypertension, like Dr. Om has already alluded, that you should be very intelligent in using molecules which have got additional benefit of decreasing uric acid, like losartan can be used here if patient is hypertensive, SGLT2 inhibitors and liraglutides. They are very good as a, you can say, one is to freebies are there that serum uric acid also comes down with their efficacy. Fenofibrate for dyslipidemia, amlodipine is also good. Other ACE inhibitors are also good. So then you have to be very, you can say you have to be, you should use these molecules intelligently. Now, regarding long-term use of uric acid lowering drugs, patient having 2 or more than 2 gouty attacks within 1 year. So they are the clear-cut indicator for long-term use. And once it is started, it has to be lifelong. Second thing, we have to be treat to target, not by decreasing only the, we have to decrease it less than 6 milligram deciliter the serum value, but also we have to look at the dissolution of monosodium urate crystals also. So it has to be treat to the target. Then if there is a breakthrough gout is there, or in between episodes of gouty are painful, then you have to go for the colchicine, 0.6 to 1.2 milligram per day. For say, you can go up to 3 to 6 months also. Various drugs are there, uricostatic drugs like xanthine oxidase inhibitors that madam has told you, that allopurinol, then oxpurinol, then febuxate. Febuxate has got benefits as it can be given in CKD patients. But the trials that if there is any benefit in CKD, it is not there. You have feather trial, you have free trial, and there is one also Levy et al. One publication was also there that it plus minus response. It is not that everywhere it is improvement in eGFR, improvement in proteinuria. It is not there. Somewhere, somewhat it is there, somewhere it is not. So you cannot label it, but you can use up to eGFR, up to even ESRD. Whereas for allopurinol, you have to decrease the dose. You have to go below even 100, even 50 milligram dose has to be used. And you have to be cautious regarding the allergic reactions to allopurinol. And I think we have to highlight something that there is some, ma'am was saying that HLA 5801 allele is there. So where there is markedly increased allopurinol hypersensitivity reactions are there. And that can be life-threatening, like it is more than even than Steven Johnson also. Secondly, the drugs, and the first line drug still is allopurinol, but we are, because we are much more tuned to it, we are much more accustomed to use of allopurinol. Febuxate is coming up in a good way. We don't care about the CARES trial because there are so many caveats in the CARES trial. Because if you see the CARES trial, there was no difference in the primary composite CV endpoints in between the allopurinol and also Febuxate. Only the CVD went high, all-cause mortality went high. That is true story. But all these things were higher when the patients were off the trial. They were 3 months out of the drug. So you cannot label the drug as a cause of CVD and increase all-cause mortality. And then when we looked at the primary endpoints and also secondary outcomes like non-fatal MI, non-fatal stroke, and also urgent revascularization for unstable angina, they were all same. So you cannot just label. That's why we don't care about the CARES trial. And then FAIRS, then the FAST trial was there, and that showed that this molecule is safe. If you see the phase 3 trials of Febuxate, there was no issue related to cardiovascular outcomes. So it was very safe in that trial. So we are using this molecule. Then regarding uricosuric drugs, probenecid, sulfenpyrazone, and this lesuronide that Madam has told, that you have to be very vigilant regarding hydration status when you are using uricosuric drugs, not to be given in patient with nephrolithosis, but no need of alkalinization. Alkalinization of urine is not required. Only thing, and also there is no need of measuring of 24-hour urinary excretion. And also stage 3 or more than 3 CKD, these drugs are not to be given. Best is to be added with xanthine oxidase inhibitor. And monotherapy, probenecid can be given, but others should be added with xanthine oxidase inhibitor. And sulfenpyrazone, which is not available to us, but still it has got benefit in CVA, cerebrovascular accident, because it has got inherent decreased platelet aggregation. And it has been recommended that CVA patient with hyperuricemia, the sulfenpyrazone can be a good alternative. Otherwise, I think we have dealt with the comorbidities of hypertension, CVD, obesity, and CKD. And chronic liver disease, you have to be watchful for febuxate. Monitoring of AST, ALT has to be done.
I think we have a lot of audience questions also.
Yeah.
Should I take?
Yeah, I'll just start, because some of the questions were already discussed. Some were, in fact, put in by me only. So I think we've had a wonderful discussion for the last 1.5 hours, and it can go on for another 1 hour without any of us actually getting bored. So question for first Dr. Om and then Dr. Harmeet. I think this is a very, very common misunderstanding that, right, left, and center, people will tell, the dietitians will tell, oh, your uric acid is 7, reduce your protein intake. I mean, they're not focused on purine-rich diet, but I remember the time when there was a lot of, chaos in the country, that the prices of dals were going up, and a very popular Baba came on TV and said, dals should not be eaten because they cause a rise in uric acid. So, from the metabolic perspective, from a bestie perspective, you're already struggling with low protein intake and a high carbohydrate intake. So what would be your message for everybody in regards of what dietary measures should be done?
Yeah, so I think this is a very pertinent question, very important. Blanket reduction of protein intake is absolutely not recommended. This is a misconception. I don't know where it came from, but it's a very common misconception across the country. So, this is what you really need to avoid are red meat, organ meat. In fact, purine-rich vegetables also have not been shown to increase the risk of gout or, hyperuricemia. So, vegetable proteins should definitely be continued. There is absolutely no indication of stopping that, reducing that, or even altering that. What you need to perhaps avoid is red meat and organ meat and certain seafoods, which are also known to increase the uric acid level. Now, fructose intake should be kept to minimum. I think this has been talked quite a few times in this forum. So wherever possible, and I think, we are in an era where fructose is very commonly used, especially in younger age group who, tend to consume food from outside, which contains a lot of fructose in all forms. So that has to be avoided. And beer, I think it's been known for many years. Beer is known to be, gouty in all sense. So I think, that has to be absolutely avoided. I think Dr. Seema talked about cherries and berries and vitamin C. I think they have been known to, be protective against hyperuricemia. So I think those should be encouraged in terms of fruit intake. But overall, maintain protein intake, but change your protein to, red meat to other sources of protein, like vegetable sources of protein, which might be much more effective and which should be also very useful in terms of uric acid reduction as well. And again, of course, so blanket guidance of just protein kam kar do, I think that's absolutely wrong. In fact, it's detrimental because, remember, we are dealing with a patient who is insulin resistant, who is having other risk factors. So I think, and protein is something which is helpful for such patients, so agar protein nahi lenge, to they'll increase a carb intake, which will be even worse. So I think in that sense, we need to be very pragmatic. We need to be very cautious, and the guidance should be very clear that it's not all protein. It is specific proteins which has to be avoided.
Milk should be continued because many patients, stop milk also.
True.
Yes, very true. Very true.
I think that's a very common myth, and this extends to the nephrology practice also. So Dr. Harmeet, your comments on, not just uric acid, but otherwise also when patients with CKD come to you, the general advice that people have given them is, cut down your protein. So what are your comments?
This is the biggest challenge we see in CKD patients. And many of the patients, they just stop eating all dals and protein in the diet, and they end up with weight loss, generalized weakness, and in the end, they become more prone to infections. So half of my practice goes in encouraging them to take the protein in the optimum amount after explaining them the importance of protein in the diet, that it helps in the wear and tear of the body, and it also helps in maintaining the immunity of the body. Anyways, average Indian diet is a low protein diet, and if we cut down the dals, even people, those who are eating non-vegetarian, they eat non-vegetarian occasionally only. So only thing I teach them is food exchange. For example, if you're taking paneer on one day, then avoid dal. If you're taking soya bean, avoid paneer. So concept of food exchange can be introduced, taking food in optimum amounts. Say fruits and vegetables are good, then again they should be consumed in optimum amount. If cherries and berries are good, that doesn't mean that they can be eaten in 1 kg. So many Punjabis are in a habit of eating. Doctor sahab acha kiya khan li, kedi cheez zyada khaiye. So the question itself is wrong. Nothing has to be consumed in more amount. Optimum limits have to be defined as in balanced meal.
Yeah. So Dr. Sandeep, there's another interesting question. So what should be the ratio of protein to carbs in our diet from the metabolic perspective? Of course, that will help in uric acid as well.
Yeah, actually, it remains same. You have to choose the type of carb you are using, that you have to omit the fructose-rich sugary drinks. Even the fruits which can be easily taken, like berries, pineapple, even banana is also good, and grapes, apple, papaya, they are all good. But those who are high rich source of fructose, they have to be avoided. And specifically sugary drinks, which are and cookies and all, these have to be avoided because they increase the ATP breakdown, and that's how they increase your purine level and uric acid level. So then regarding protein, actually, it is the restriction of only purine-rich red meat, which is there. Not dal, soybean, they are all very good. Low-fat milk, they can be very easily taken. Cheese, actually, they are higher in orotic acid, which increases uric acid excretion. Even egg is also good. Egg is less in purine, very less, high and good amount of vitamin B12, that is the actual source. B6 is on a higher side, choline is on a higher side, and all they lead to decrease in uric acid level. So, and vitamin C has to be taken in the form of fruits. Lemon is good for vitamin C source of vitamin C, and amla is good for vitamin C source. They can be taken. But overall, if you look at the diet, what it leads to, it decreases uric acid only by 1 milligram, not more than that.
True.
So it is not to decrease the gouty pain. It is only to prevent the further attack of the gout. So this has to be remembered in our mind.
Right. I think that's very well put and summarized beautifully. So Dr. Chanchal, there is one question. We've discussed it in the last 1.5 hours or so. But let's say we have a patient come to you for the first time with a high uric acid level, but is asymptomatic. So what time period would you put to repeat a level, and then, would you consider drug management? I think that we've discussed, but how do you decide it's persistent hyperuricemia and not just one odd value?
So like Dr. Harmeet had said, if somebody comes with one uric acid value, there is no point of managing or treating it. So we have to really maybe after 4 weeks and your patient is completely asymptomatic. So maybe after 4 weeks, we can call that patient for again uric acid. But in case if he is completely asymptomatic, there is no need to chase it. Only thing is we have to chase it, like if patient is overweight, hypertensive, diabetes. So all those metabolic factors, we have to just counsel patient about reversing these factors and lifestyle management. There is no need to chase asymptomatic hyperuricemia.
True. So I think that was beautifully put forth by Om earlier, that it's like we get thyroid patients with the borderline with TPO antibodies elevated and TSH normal, and we start chasing that. So what I always tell my patients is, look, TPO antibody is just a witness. Witness se gawahi leni hai, but we are not going to involve him in the operation theater. So he'll just tell us where the problem is, and we fix the problem. Om, since SGLT2 inhibitors also promote uricosuria, should we be concerned that it might increase urolithiasis?
Well, interesting question. I think we have now ton of data on all kinds of SGLT2 inhibitors. I think none of them have actually reported increase, because you are looking at treating patients who are high risk of hyperuricemia, and none of these trials, now we have thousands and thousands of patients, in trials and post trial marketing surveillance and all kinds of data. I think there's no signal at this point of time to suggest that it has been shown to increase, urate stones. So I would not be too much concerned about it, and there is no data. But I think this is something very interesting. We perhaps, maybe in these trials, if there's a sub-analysis somewhere done, perhaps you can have a close look at this. But I think it's so far not been reported for such a thing to happen. And in clinical practice also, we're not seeing that happen. So, but it's an interesting question.
Yeah, when SGLT2 inhibitors did come in, there was a fear that they might cause AKI. And one of the mechanisms proposed was that they cause uricosuriia. But then I think down the line, we've had so many CPOTs and renal outcome studies, which have laid to rest that even in renal patients, we don't actually see any AKI or uric acid related issues. So I think there's another question that Dr. Seema had already answered, that should thiazide diuretics be given in these patients? I think Om had also highlighted that. So would you want to continue thiazide diuretics in a patient with hyperuricemia? Dr. Prerna or Dr. Seema can answer and we'll wind up.
See, thiazide diuretic, can I answer it?
Yes, please.
Dr. Seema, go ahead.
The contribution of thiazide diuretic in raising uric acid is very, very low. It will be like 0.7 mg/%.
Yeah.
So if it is needed, thiazide diuretic, it should be continued. There is no need to hold it. If you can, get away with it by stopping it, it's okay.
That's right.
But if your patient requires it, continue it, no problem.
Right.
I think difficult to treat patients who are already on urate-lowering therapies, but still uric acid is not coming down. Then we can aim for these therapies like the other medicines which are going on, which are contributing to the high uric acid. So, but first line agents like thiazide are given for particular condition. Why should we stop because of the high uric acid?
One very important point, sorry, I am interfering in between. Actually, in this discussion now, one very important thing got missed. So I just wanted to convey, if somebody has gout, means documented gout is there and urate lowering therapy is started, we have to chase uric acid. It has to be kept below 6, and please never ever stop that urate lowering therapy. Because all of our patients, they will come कि uric acid कम हो गया था जी, हमने दवाई बंद कर दी. And gout is one disease of all rheumatological disorder which is curable. So if you keep consistently, if you keep uric acid level lower than 6, your disease is going to disappear 100%. So this is one message I definitely wanted to convey to all the audience here. Sorry for
apart from the acute attack, the uric chloride therapy, I think they should be continued till the appearance of the tophi also. Like if the patient is having even complete dissolution of the tophi and any radiological evidence, you should continue.
Even your radiological erosions, they will disappear over the period of time. So it is so beautiful that you have to continue this drug for whole life. Never ever stop it in between.
That is wonderful. Any final words from Dr. Sandeep, sir?
Yeah, ma'am. I was thinking that nobody is talking about coffee. I think you are not going to give us any coffee, so that's why nobody is talking about coffee.
True, sir.
So yes, I think coffee is very important when you are looking at uric acid. Caffeinated versus decaffeinated, there is another story. But you can say it has got diuretic action, and 1 to 3 cups of coffee can decrease uric acid by 8%. And they say that if you decrease by 4 to 5 cups, it decreases by 40%. It has got antioxidant action, and it is just like equivalent to allopurinol. So, and it decreases your gouty attacks also. So coffee is very important. And I think everything has been covered, but still we require more evidence. Specifically, when you look at asymptomatic hyperuricemia, we are much more convinced regarding when it is there with comorbidities and when there is frank renal involvement and urolithiasis is there. then we are very much easy to use these molecules. And we are convinced that allopurinol oblique febuxostat, depending upon the patient's phenotype, we can use them. And also uricosuric drugs are an add-on to these. And then we have got another good drugs like interleukin-1 receptor antagonist like anakinra, and canakinumab is also coming up, and interleukin-1 beta antagonist monoclonal antibodies there. So they are also very good drugs for acute gout and injectable therapy when everything is failing. The thing is that it is now treatable, it is curable. You have to stay with the drugs lifelong, treat to the target. You have to see the resolution of monosodium urate crystals and decrease the level below 6 milligram. And that's all I think we can conclude here.
I think that was really wonderful. I think I've stayed glued to my chair for the last 1.5 hours, not even got up for a cup of coffee.
Yes.
So sincere thanks so much, Dr. Sandeep Suri sir, for beautifully tying up together the whole symposium. And thanks to Dr. Om, Dr. Harmeet, Dr. Seema, and Dr. Chanchal Gera for their wonderful insights. Really a lot of learning experience. Yeah. I think the easiest thing, when you don't know a topic is give it to a bunch of experts like you and then learn from them. And special thanks goes to Prerna. This entire topic and this series, is her idea. She's come up with some beautiful, innovative ideas of what we can discuss in interdisciplinary meetings. So big round of applause for Prerna.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks a lot.
Definitely.
I think we are just executing the things that is given to us by Dr. Gagan only.
Yeah.
All the brain behind all the meetings is basically of Dr. Gagan, and hats off to her dedication and hard work that she is giving. And I think we ourselves are learning a lot from because of your contribution, Dr. Gagan. So all applause to you.
I think Flame is learning from each other. Now we are extending.
She made us work too.
Yeah.
So it's really wonderful to see the flame spreading from south of India to even Ahmedabad now, and Dr. Sandeep has been so supportive. So wonderful, and special thanks to all the audience who join us and who also follow the YouTube videos later. So we'll be posting this video. And on behind the desk has been the ERIS team, who has been who also did the hypertension symposium flawlessly. So thanks to ERIS. Virender is here, Manish is here. So thanks a lot, and we'll close this session. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
रिकॉर्ड करूंगी तो